see you all here. As you know, this is the public lecture series. It's got a mixture of guest speakers and more typically inaugural lectures. It's fair to say that none of the inaugural lectures sell out in quite the speed this one did. They sell out at all. Anyway, my name's Jeff Holmes. I'm the PVC for the STEM area, but also health, so you could think of it as stealth, I guess. So that's why I'm kind of introducing the speaker today, because that's the topic. But before I do that, I'd just like to give you some housekeeping. We are the hosts for you here, and we want to look after you while you're here. So before we get underway, just cover off a few housekeeping points. Toilets, you may have seen, are located opposite the Opus Bar in the centre of the main foyer. Just turn right as you go out here. If there's a fire alarm goes off, please remain calm. Please listen to the Academy staff. They'll ask you to vacate the room as quickly and as orderly as possible, and you'll be directed outside to one of the congregation assembly points. Please do not, under any circumstances, try to re-enter the building until the staff have given the all clear in such circumstances. And then finally, if you do have a cell phone, it would be great at this point to put it onto silent or turn it off or throw it away or something like that. So I thought I'd just, obviously want to get onto the speaker. I was just reflecting myself as I was driving in this morning on the NASA program and its impact that it's had, on me in particular. And there was a couple of things I thought of. First of all, the first thing I thought of, for some reason, was just how extraordinarily variable the presidents of the United States are. Because I was thinking of JFK at the time, and the space race in the 60s, and where I was when I saw Neil Armstrong plant the flag. I still remember that very vividly. Anyway, on to Anna Fisher. She is one of the first female astronauts. She's now retired, of course, to be selected by NASA. She's also a chemist and a medical doctor who specialises in emergency medicine. Dr. Fisher worked on the Space Shuttle Program, the International Space Station, and the Orion capsule that is being developed for NASA's future space launch system. Additionally, she was a crew representative to support Space Shuttle integrated testing and payload testing. During the early phase of building the International Space Station, she was the chief of the Space Station branch. So, with me, could you please give a warm Hamilton welcome to Dr. Anna Fisher.
It's a real pleasure to be here, actually to be in New Zealand, because I flew over New Zealand and Australia a lot when I was up in space, but I've never actually been here. So it's a real pleasure to be here. I know this is also your exam period for some of the younger folks here, and I'm not sure I would have taken time out of my exam period to come listen to someone, so I thank you very much for coming. It's a real pleasure and honor for me to get to be here and share with you my experiences. So what I'm going to do, I'm very passionate about space and careers with STEM backgrounds, or STEAM I should say now. And so I can more easily talk for an hour and a half than I can talk for 45 minutes. So I'm going to get started. I want to try to finish my talk in about 45 minutes or so, and then I want to definitely leave time for questions and answers at the end. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and get started. I always like to start with a picture of when I was a child. This is when I was in second grade. Partially because when I'm talking to audiences, if there's some young people in the audience, I'd like them to know that yes, I was a child at one point too, and you don't just pop out as an astronaut. But it also reminds me to talk about a few things. One, I was a very shy nerd as a child. I actually loved doing my math homework, which my daughters can't believe that I actually admit to. But it also reminds me to talk about the first time that I decided I wanted to be an astronaut. My father was in the military and we moved a great deal. We were stationed at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, sort of in the middle of the United States. And early in the morning we were outside with my first class. I was 12 years old, and we were outside with our PE teacher. And we were crowded around listening to Al Shepard, the first American to launch into space for his suborbital flight in May 5th, 1961. Like I said, I was 12 years old, 7th grade, and at that moment, listening to him talk to Mission Control, I said to myself, I want to do that someday. It was, to me, the perfect combination of something that had science, it was challenging, it was exploring, just everything that I wanted to do. But of course, back in those days, 1961, that wasn't a very realistic goal for a young girl. The first astronauts had just been selected, the Mercury 7. They were all male, and they were test pilots. But the seed was planted, and I really like to emphasize that for younger folks in the audience, in case you have a dream, because as you see, as I'll talk some more, that didn't seem like a very likely thing that was going to happen. As I said, my father was in the military. We moved a great deal. In fact, when he retired, when we moved to Los Angeles at his last post that he was stationed at, I was in 8th grade, I was 13, and 8th grade was my 13th school. So, I learned to be very adaptable as we moved around. I was really happy to be in middle school and high school in one place. And even today, I really value those friendships because I think perhaps I appreciate them more having moved around. As I said, I was very much a nerd even then. I loved science, I loved math. I was the first person in my family to go to college. I applied to one school, the University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA, and was very fortunate to be accepted. I started out in math, but I started thinking about what was I going to do with math. I wasn't sure that I was smart enough to be a theoretical mathematician and a professor, and I also really loved science, so I wound up taking some courses in chemistry and decided that I wanted to get my bachelor's in chemistry. And as that went along, I really loved that as well, but I thought I really wanted to combine my love of science with working more with people. So I decided to go to medical school, and again was very fortunate to get in and decided to go into emergency medicine. By this time, it looked like I wasn't going to have a chance to become an astronaut, but I hadn't totally given up yet because I thought, well, maybe one of these days there'll be a space station and I could be a doctor on a space station. But I didn't tell that to the admission committee because I thought they would think I was kind of nuts back then. But anyway, my then fiance and later husband was a year ahead of me in medical school. And one of my medical school friends was the intern on his service, and they were having lunch one day. And Mark told my husband, NASA is looking for astronauts, and not just pilot astronauts this time, but mission specialists for this new space shuttle. So this was before the space shuttle had even flown. I can still remember at the hospital that I was training at in Los Angeles, Bill paging me and saying, Anna, we have 1 month before the deadline. The application process had been open for about a year, and it still to this day kind of makes me kind of shudder thinking that, what if he hadn't been hungry that day and they hadn't gone to lunch? I'm not sure. It just kind of, it's sort of strange how life takes these turns. Anyway, back in those days there was no internet, so you had to call NASA, have them mail an application, you had to fill it out. Get your letters of recommendations, your transcripts and everything, that whole process, all the while you're in the middle of your internship. I got my application in like the day before the deadline, and 6 weeks later found myself in Houston interviewing with the first group of women ever interviewed for the program. And then in January of 1978, about 5 or 6 months later, found out that I was very lucky to be in the first class of astronauts ever selected specifically for the Space Shuttle Program. You can see it's a pretty large class. There were 35 of us, 15 pilots, 20 mission specialists. It was the most diverse class that NASA had ever selected, and it was the first class ever to have accepted women. The six of us on the left is Dr. Shannon Lucid, biochemist, Dr. Ray Seddon, medical doctor. She was training to be a surgeon. Dr. Kathy Sullivan, a geologist. Dr. Judy Resnick, electrical engineer. And unfortunately, she was killed in the Challenger accident, myself. And Dr. Sally Wright, the first American woman to fly in space. And also, unfortunately, she passed away in 2012 from pancreatic cancer. About a year ago, an artist who designs patches, and you can see all the patches I'm wearing, every crew has a patch, every class has a patch. So one of the artists who likes to work with crews and design patches designed this patch for the six of us, and I'm wearing it somewhere here. I always forget where I had it. But I like to think that although Judy and Sally are not here, that they would have appreciated and liked this patch, because we thought it's pretty special. This is a picture of the Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas. That's where I live, and if you want to be an astronaut in the United States, that's where we're all based. You can kind of see that the Space Center looks a little bit like a university, not unlike the university here. It's where all of our simulators are located and where all of our training took place. When you're first selected as an astronaut, you're called an astronaut candidate. And for us, that period was about a year. For some of the more recent classes, because they have a little bit more to learn, namely they have to learn Russian, because, and I'll talk about that a little later in my talk, because we have to launch on the Russian Soyuz the last several years. So their candidacy period lasts a little bit longer. But as NASA is prone to do, they always come up with acronyms and abbreviations, so we're affectionately known as the ASCANs when we first get started. But whenever you finish that, what I call sort of a trial period, after that we have various jobs that we have in the office. My first job was to work in the area of spacesuits and spacewalks. And they didn't even have a shuttle suit back when we were selected. This actually is an Apollo suit because they haven't, like I said, made the first shuttle suit. And you can see it's a little, you'll see in a later slide what the shuttle suit looks like. But this is a one-piece suit. It's what they used to walk on the moon. And in fact, Pete Conrad was the shortest of the Apollo astronauts. So I've actually got to wear his suit, and they were able to make it short enough. But as you can see, it's still pretty big and didn't fit too well. However, nonetheless, we still did a lot of the early preparatory tests in the water and these tether hooks that we use to hook our equipment and to hook ourselves to the tethers. And there's a mini workstation that we carry our tools out. Those are still on board the International Space Station now, all these years later. So it's kind of a neat way to start our career. A lot of times people wonder, well, what do you do when you're not flying in space? And we have lots of different jobs. So at different times, I worked in the facility where we verify our software. I worked as a Capcom in mission control, did some development work on the robotic arm. We have a group of astronauts that work at the Kennedy Space Center to get the shuttle ready, get the cockpit configured with the switches in the right position. And so we have all these different jobs which also contribute to our training. But then finally, in July of 1983, about 2 weeks before my daughter was born, I was assigned to my flight. And, you know, it was like kind of exciting to be assigned to your first flight. But like I said, I was 8.5 months pregnant at the time. And then I delivered Kristen on a Friday, and on the following Monday, I was at our Monday morning meeting just to be able to make sure that everyone knew that although I just had a baby, I was definitely not going to be going anywhere. And in fact, I was the first mom to fly in space, and my daughter always reminds me that I owe it all to her. So And I guess that's true in a sense. But anyway, one of the first things you do when you're assigned to a crew, everyone loves to design their patch, and our commander allowed Dave Walker and myself, we were the two rookies on board, to at least come up with the concept for our patch. And so we had our names around the outside. There were 2 satellites because we were going to deploy 2 satellites. And then for the first time in history, we were going to bring 2 satellites back that were in orbit. They were launched on an earlier shuttle mission, and then the rocket that was supposed to take them to a higher orbit failed about 4 seconds into what should have been a 4-minute burn. And so these perfectly good multi-million-dollar satellites were on orbit, but they were totally useless because they were in the wrong place. So for the first time ever, we were sent up really because the insurance underwriters, Lloyd's of London and several others, really pressured NASA to go get those satellites. And it was, I don't have time to go into all the details of it. It was the most exciting mission you could ever imagine, because this happened in February and we launched in November, so we were part of all the development and everything, and it was just a lot of fun. So we have the 2 satellites to represent the 2 we would deploy and the 2 we would bring back. 5 stars for the crew members, and since I was the first mom to fly in space and I was designing the patch, I have a star for my daughter, Kristen. So training for a shuttle mission takes anywhere from a year to about a year and a half. Unlike for the International Space Station, training for the space station nowadays takes about 2.5 to 3 years. And half that time you're gone because of the facilities with our international partners are really spread all over the world. And you're gone for half of that 2.5-year period, and then you go into space for 6 months. So it's a very different program from the shuttle. For the shuttle, most of the training was at the Johnson Space Center, and for the most part, the training was about a year to a year and a half. And like I said, most of that was in Houston, but about 2 or 3 weeks before launch, we went to the Kennedy Space Center for a practice launch, and called the TCDT, or the practice countdown, and that's where this picture was taken. It's Dale Gardner, who would be one of my crewmates going out to do the spacewalk, our commander, Rick Hout, Dr. Joe Allen, who would also be doing the spacewalk, myself, I was the robotic arm operator and the flight engineer, and Dave Walker, our pilot. And also at that same trip was one of the last times that the payload bay doors for the shuttle were open, so that you could see whatever your payload was. So these are the 2 satellites that we're going to deploy from the shuttle payload bay. And then in this big empty space up here, doesn't look so big from here, but trust me, it's about half the payload bay is where the 2 satellites would go that we were going to bring back. And this satellite, Hughes 376 communication satellite, is identical to the 2 that are on orbit that we were going to go retrieve. So this is the week before you launch into space. You go into quarantine, and you spend about 3 days at the Johnson Space Center doing your last final bits of training. And then about 3 days before launch, you go to the Kennedy Space Center. And then the morning of launch, this is a very traditional picture. Every crew takes a picture at breakfast. And you can see there's not a lot of food there. And the reason is, or a lot to drink. And if any of you are going to be lucky enough to perhaps fly on Virgin Galactic or SpaceX or any of the new vehicles that are coming along, you might want to listen to this part of my talk, because you really don't want to drink a lot and you really don't want to eat a lot the mornings you're going to launch. And the reason is, if you're going to be out on the pad, and you're going to be out there no matter what the launch vehicle is, somewhere on the order of 3 hours. And if you can imagine your seat, you lay your seat back on the floor, and you're laying in that position for about 3 hours. If you don't have a drop to drink that morning, you're going to have to go to the bathroom really badly. And you don't want to make it any worse by drinking a lot. And then the other thing is, you don't want to eat a lot, because about 60 to 70% of astronauts, cosmonauts, taikonauts, which is what the Chinese call their astronauts, have what's called space adaptation syndrome, which is a fancy term for symptoms that are very much like being seasick. So nausea, malaise. And if you think throwing up here on the ground is unpleasant, let me assure you that throwing up in space is way, way worse. So I absolutely didn't want to take any chances, so I really didn't eat a lot. So here we are getting ready to walk out to the pad, and to the van that's going to take us out to the pad. And then we launched on the Space Shuttle Discovery, and I was the fourth person to ingress the vehicle and get strapped. I had quite a bit of time that I got to stand out on that access arm and look out at the ocean. It was almost a full moon, and think about what I was about to go do, and to remember that time long ago when I was 12 years old when I first decided I wanted to be an astronaut, and here it was about to come true. So it was a very surreal feeling. You almost don't believe that it's really happening. This is what it looks like inside the cockpit. We flew before Challenger, so we wore flight suits pretty much like what I'm wearing right now. After Challenger, they started wearing those orange pressure garments. Here's where the commander sits, the pilot, Mission Specialist 2, which is Joe, and then I'm MS2, Mission Specialist 2. And you can see that I can get a really good view of all the displays and switches and everything. And as I said, I was the flight engineer, so on ascent and entry, my job was to make sure that we were on the timeline and that we didn't forget anything. And if we were to have a malfunction, which thankfully we didn't, make sure we were working the right procedure. So this is what it looked like. We had a scrub one day. We were supposed to launch November 7th, but the winds at altitude were too great, and so we wound up launching on November 8th, which was Dale's birthday, and when the launch director called to wish us good luck and a successful mission, Dale promised to not blow out the candles. And so this is the way the shuttle works, a little closer up view. So we have the two solid rocket boosters on either side, and then there's the three main engines that receives its fuel, liquid oxygen and hydrogen from the large orange external tank. There's over 7 million pounds of thrust at liftoff when the solids ignite. So now, if you can imagine, I'm going to show you a very short video. It's about a minute or less. So if you could imagine your seats as I said before, with your back on the floor, and you're laying there, and you've been laying out on the pad for about 3 hours, and now you're getting ready to lift off. And I'm going to try to explain a bit about what it felt like. At about 10 seconds before liftoff, the computer sends a command to the three main engines. The three main engines ignite, and the computer checks to make sure that the three engines are functioning properly, and when satisfied, it sends the command to the solid rocket. You may not know where you're going, but you definitely know you're going somewhere. It's a real kick in the seat of the pants. You can see from that brief shot of the cockpit, a lot of vibration, a lot of noise in the first stage. The first stage is the time that the solid rocket boosters are burning. They burn for approximately a little over 2 minutes. And at about a little over 2 minutes into the flight, again, the computer sends a command to fire the pyros, and the pyros ignite, and the solid rockets are jettisoned. They each have a parachute, and they fall into the ocean, and then they're covered by the folks at the Kennedy Space Center, and each solid rocket booster was used approximately 10 times. Once the solids are gone, the ride is as smooth as glass, and it's just a constant acceleration up till about 6 or 6.5 minutes into the ascent profile when you achieve 3 Gs, and then the computer has the engines throttle back to maintain 3 Gs. And what that means is if you weighed 100 kilograms here on the ground, for a very brief period you would weigh 300 kilograms. But the Gs are through your chest, so although it's a little uncomfortable to breathe, it really isn't that uncomfortable at all, and it only lasts for about 2 or 2.5 minutes. So And so then you go from 0 kilometers per hour to 26,500 kilometers per hour, which is orbital velocity, in 8.5 minutes, just to give you an idea of just how fast things are happening. And in an instant, you go from 3 Gs to weightless. When those 3 main engines cut off at 8.5 minutes, again, you just go, you're immediately weightless. And you can almost feel the blood that's left in your legs after sitting on the pad for 3 hours that normally would be pooling in your legs, sort of shifting into your central venous system. And then you're going to get rid of that fluid over the next couple of days because your body senses it as a fluid overload. And if you look at astronauts' faces, the first couple of days when they're on orbit, their faces are really full, usually, and gets rid of all your wrinkles. Wonderful. You look about 10 years younger, but unfortunately they all come back. I'm going to show you a little bit about what it was like to live and work in space. And although the shuttle is not flying any longer, a lot of what I'm going to talk about is very similar to what's on the space station or some of the new vehicles that we're working on that I'll talk about very briefly at the end of my talk. So the space shuttle, though, was like a little tiny 2-story apartment. And the upper flight deck looks very much like the cockpit of a commercial jet. And you can see our commander, Rick Hout, sitting in his commander seat. There are over 2,000 switches and circuit breakers in the shuttle, and most of them are on the flight deck, as opposed to the new Orion vehicle that I'm going to mention at the end of my talk, where it's controlled primarily through displays. I think there's about 25 or 30 switches in that vehicle, and most of those are just emergency backups in case there's a computer failure. And again, so about 2,000 in the shuttle, so it's really changing the way we design spacecraft. But here's, and then we also have a bunch of checklists. We carried over 300 pounds of checklists. This was our crew activity plan, which was like a Bible telling us what we were going to do every minute of every day we were on orbit. And once you get on orbit, the seats that Joe and I were sitting in are no longer necessary, and not only that, they get in your way. So they were designed to be folded and stowed. And then you can see, like, this is the panel from which the commander, the pilot, can fly the shuttle to dock with the International Space Station, or as we were going to do, to rendezvous and join up with the satellite. And then the panel on this side is where I operated the robotic arm from. And then below, if there is a below in weightlessness, was the mid-deck. And the mid-deck is where everything else was. It's where our equipment were stowed, where we had experiments, if we had any. You can see I'm holding onto the handle of our treadmill, which is where we exercise, although I'll have to be honest, our flight was so busy. I think we maybe used the treadmill once or twice that entire flight because we were just too busy. We each had a locker, and everything was color-coded. Red was for the commander, yellow for the pilot, blue for Mission Specialist 1, and green for me. That way, if you saw a packet of food or a checklist, you could immediately tell whose it was by the little color tag on it. They allowed us to fly stickers from our colleges, from our military affiliation, pictures of our family. You can see I'm demonstrating space hair here. There's no such thing as a flat hair day. And I'm wearing a necklace. Actually, it's the necklace I'm wearing here. After the talk, you want to see it. A little bit about the food in space. Well, first I should say I definitely was one of those 60 or 70% that had space adaptation syndrome. Luckily, I didn't eat anything, and I didn't eat anything hardly at all for 2 days because I definitely didn't want to throw up. And so I woke up on the morning of the 3rd day, and I was absolutely starving. I had a hot dog, and it was the best hot dog I had in my life. Probably the most expensive, too, but most of the food is freeze-dried, kind of like backpacking food, or like the little cups of noodles that students love to live on when you're in college, and you just added some water and then heated it up. My favorite was beef stroganoff. And some really nice engineer designed this tray to hold all of our little containers, because you can imagine what it would be like to try to eat if all those little containers were floating around and everything. fact, if one of the things, Scott Kelly, who was the astronaut that was up on the station, the U.S. astronaut that was on the station for a year, he talks about one of the things he really missed was being able to sit at a table and have dinner, you know, with your family or your friends. But at least this gave us a sort of a feeling of having that, having a tray with your stuff. And you can see this is a breakfast. There's orange juice and coffee. And this is a video I'm not going to have time to show. It just shows how we prepare meals, and if you're interested, I could show it to you at the end. A little bit about sleeping in space. I remember the first night when I got up there, it felt so strange. I kept feeling like I wanted a pillow to put my head on, but of course you're floating, so you really don't need to do that. Nobody in my crew wanted to use their sleeping bags like an actual sleeping bag to get inside them. So we had 2 sleeping bags here attached to the wall and 2 up here. And so I created this kind of little hammocky arrangement, which let me float, but at the same time feel a little bit secure. On the space station, each crew member actually has a little telephone booth size bedroom, if you will. And again, it doesn't matter what orientation you're in, you can sleep in any orientation. So they have a little more luxurious quarters than we had, but this worked really well. And, but eventually, even I got to where I felt comfortable just sleeping free floating. This is a picture my crewmate Joe took. I didn't even know he took it until we got back and I was going through our photographs. But you can see I'm taking a little power nap. This is on the last day as we're getting ready to go home. And you can see there's a little tether holding me to the handle of the treadmill. So, it's kind of cool. Everybody wants to know how you go to the bathroom in space, but nobody wants to ask. So here's our pilot, Dave Walker. Hopefully he's just simulating here. Excuse me. And the Waste Management System, or WMS as NASA called it, is kind of like a porta potty that you'll see at a festival or a concert or a marathon, something like that. We have checklists for everything, as I said, and here's the checklist. You definitely do not want to screw this one up, believe me, you'll be very unpopular. But I think I'll leave the rest to your imagination. The one thing that NASA added when we started flying mixed gender, male-female crews, was this privacy curtain. But as you can see, you really don't have a lot of privacy. And so I always tell young folks, if they're aspiring to be an astronaut, you better not have a lot of need for privacy. You get to know your crewmates really well, perhaps better than you really want to know them. So I'm just going to very, very briefly show you a bit about what we did on our flight, because as I said, it was really an amazing flight, a very historic flight, and just an effort, an example of NASA's amazing capability and teamwork. So we launched the 2 satellites that I showed you on day 2, one on day 2, one on day 3. Day 4 was a preparation day. Joe and Dale were checking their spacesuits. Rick and I were getting ready. He and I were going to be doing the rendezvous while the other crew members were down on the mid-deck at the airlock, getting them dressed and into their spacesuits to go outside. And so you have to realize those were very long days. Just the rendezvous itself takes approximately 6 hours. And then the spacewalk itself was somewhere between 6 and 7 hours. So you're talking really long days for both of those days. So on day 5 and on day 7, we rendezvoused with the Palapa and the West Star satellites. And I don't have time to explain all the details. If someone's interested, you can ask me later. But basically, here's this satellite that was not designed to be retrieved. For me to grab something with a robotic arm, it needs to have a special grapple fixture on it. And so we had to figure out a way to do that. And so here you see Dale in his spacesuit with his Buck Rogers manned maneuvering unit backpack with a device that we have designed to go and dock with the aft or nozzle end of the satellite. The satellite has solar arrays all around it, and if we damage those, there's really no point bringing the satellite back. It would cost more to refurbish it, so we had to be very careful handling it. And And so then, here's Dale. He has docked with the satellite. I have maneuvering the arm, and Joe is in a set of foot restraints on the end of the arm, kind of like a cherry picker. And then once Dale brings the stops the rotation of the satellite, and then brings it over to Joe, then he undocks, and they go into the payload bay, and then attach another piece of hardware that's going to hook the satellite down into the payload bay. Very careful choreography. And then finally, at the end of the second spacewalk on day 7, they brought out their little for sale sign that they had made, which was kind of a joke, but not really, because the insurance underwriters were so excited. This was the second largest salvage operation that Lloyd's of London ever had. The number 1 was a Spanish galleon that went down off the coast of Florida with a ton of gold on board. So they were really happy, and as were we. It was really exciting time. So then we had one more day where we had to pack everything up, get ready to go back home. And then on the morning of the 9th day, we did our deorbit burn. And at that point, once you slow down from the orbital velocity, basically you become a meteorite and you're entering the Earth's atmosphere. You're hoping that the guidance officer really did their homework well, because you only get one chance to land the shuttle because it's a glider. This is a picture that one of my friends took as we went overhead Houston. And then we were the second shuttle to land at the Kennedy Space Center. And for those of you that are perhaps familiar with the United States, normally a commercial flight from Houston to Orlando, which is where the Kennedy Space Center is located, takes about 2 hours. We did that trip in about 4 minutes, just to give you an idea of how fast you're traveling. And we were, as I said, we were the first flight ever to bring hardware back from space, and we were met by custom officials asking if we had anything to declare. So I remember when we landed, I felt like a 800-pound gorilla. Excuse me if I go back and forth between Imperial, I've learned, as opposed to metric, but it's I kind of go back and forth between the two. But I remember I felt so heavy. It was amazing to me how quickly the human body adapts to weightlessness and gets used to it. And then when you come back, you feel so heavy. I had some switches to throw on the overhead panel. They had in the simulator. It took me maybe 30 seconds. It probably took me several minutes to get my arm up and reach them and make sure I was on the right switch. So, and you can see here that we're all very carefully holding on to the handle of the steps to exit the shuttle. And in fact, after a couple of flights, I think it was like probably after Challenger, they stopped doing this. They have a vehicle that would pull up to the hatch, and then they could bring the crew out, and we would have flight surgeons on board to give you an IV, because mostly you're coming back dehydrated because of the fluid shifts I told you about. So they actually stopped doing it this way. And so we went back to the crew quarters, took a shower. It felt great to take a shower after 9 days of no shower. And then we landed at about 7:30 in the morning. And about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, we were back in Houston. And I cannot tell you how happy I was to see my little girl. That was, I think we were apart for about 15 days. And it was probably the longest we'd ever been apart since she was born. So I'd like to shift gears now and just share with you some pictures of the amazing view from space, and also remind me to talk about a couple of other things. Every photographer tries to capture the perfect sunrise or sunset. And when you're orbiting the Earth, it takes about 90 minutes to orbit the Earth. And every 45 minutes, you're going to be seeing either a sunrise or a sunset. It never gets old. They're amazing. The aurora borealis, looking into the Mediterranean, looking into the Middle East, Sinai Peninsula, and one of the things that all astronauts, cosmonauts, and taikonauts will say, taikonauts is what the Chinese call their astronauts, is once you get on orbit and you see this amazing view, you don't see any borders like you do on maps. And you just see this planet as one whole beautiful planet, or one beautiful little spaceship in a way, if you want to think of it that way. And you really wish that more and more people would get a chance to see this view. And that's why I'm really excited about the commercial crew programs that you're hearing about with Elon Musk and Richard Branson and so forth, because I think more people, they get to see this and appreciate how amazing this planet is, and then turn around and look to the vast blackness of space. And it really makes you appreciate and think about how we really should take care not only of our planet, but of each other. This is the Himalayas, which I love looking at. The views in the daytime are just spectacular, but I just absolutely love the nighttime views. This is Greece, Tokyo and Tokyo Harbor. And Africa truly is the dark continent. And the only thing you see really at night is light along the Nile Delta and the Nile River and along the coast. And the other thing that was really fun to watch was the thunderstorms, where you would watch lightning propagating from over hundreds of miles. But other than that, Africa is definitely the dark continent at night, unlike the United States, which is lit up like a Christmas tree, and you can see the whole outline of the United States. This is Los Angeles. I can almost pick out my house, right? And this is the Johnson Space Center. And then this is the Kennedy Space Center where we launched. This is pad 39A, 39B, the vertical assembly building, and the 15,000-foot runway where we would land. And to go from the west coast of the United States to the east coast, again, takes about 8.5 minutes. If you were to do that in a commercial flight, it would probably be around 5 hours. Again, just to give you an idea of how fast you're traveling. Then I just love this slide, of Europe with all the cities labeled, so I don't have to remember what each one is. I just love this shot of Italy on a really clear night. And then you might recognize what this is. And just in case you don't, it's labeled for you. And this is Christchurch. And I really looked hard to find Hamilton and but this is the only picture I could find anywhere of the North Island that isn't covered by clouds. I mean, I looked through all the photography there is, and they're just, the North Island almost always is obscured by clouds. So, with that, I'm going to shift gears a little bit. I'm not going to talk very long about this, but just to give you a glimpse of what our training is like. For the shuttle, we had 2 simulators. We had a motion base for ascent entry and a fixed base for orbit. This is a motion base, and you can see how similar the simulator looks to the shuttle. And in fact, we spent hundreds of hours in the simulator so that by the time you're up on orbit in space, it really feels like home. And even now, when I get into the mock-up that we have still at the Space Center, it feels like you're going home. In addition, though, there are many other wonderful jobs in the space program. Astronaut is just one of them, kind of the tip of the iceberg. But in mission control, we have all these different positions that need to be filled. Those are all people with a degree in some area of STEM and have to go through extensive training to understand their systems. And then the boss of mission control, of course, is a flight director. Interestingly, we had the first female astronauts picked in 1978, but we didn't have the first female flight director until 1984. So now we have several. We also have a full-scale mock-up of the International Space Station. This is where the space station crews come to do their emergency training. And lots of other training, but it's the only place where they have the entire space station so they can practice what they would do in the case of a fire or a depress, the 4 big emergencies. And then we have this other facility, a swimming pool called the NewtoAvoid Sealab, and NASA always has to come up with a special fancy name for everything. And you can see there's all of our mock-ups, and this is where we train for spacewalks. And you can see, as I mentioned earlier, that the shuttle suit was different than the suit I showed you earlier. This is the shuttle suit. It's a two-piece suit. The lower torso that you put on, and then the hard upper torso is hooked onto this device that's going to lower you into the water. Getting into that suit is really, really difficult. So then you have weights, lead weights that are going to be around your legs, and then they put some on your arms when you get in the water. And then they lower you into the water and make you as neutrally buoyant as they can. Physically, this is the hardest training we do. And we actually have a lot of rotator cuff shoulder injuries just because of all the time you spend in there. And then you go through your procedures for your spacewalk, whatever your particular task is. We also use that facility to practice our procedures if you were going to bail out of the shuttle. And you practice getting into it. Have you ever tried to get into a raft when you're in a flight suit with boots on? It is not easy. And also the procedures in case we had to bail out of a T38. We have a small fleet of T38s, which is how it's the aircraft that the Air Force uses to train pilots for the U.S. Air Force. And NASA bought a small number of them, and that's how the pilots in the office maintain their proficiency as pilots. And as a mission specialist, we fly in the back seat, and we do communication, navigation. And the other thing that's really important about the T38s is when you're in a simulator, all of our other training is in simulators. And in the back of your mind, if you make a bad mistake, you may die of embarrassment, but you're not going to actually die. In a T38, you can have an equipment malfunction, you can have weather issues and all sorts of things. So it's a very realistic environment for us to train in. Of course, throughout most of my time with NASA, we didn't have iPhones, so we weren't taking pictures all the time and selfies and all that. And towards the end of my time flying, I had my cell phone in my pocket, and I went, "Oh, I'm going to take a selfie." So this is my selfie in the T38. Real briefly, I'd just like to talk about what is currently going on. One of the things that I really enjoyed working on was I was the chief of the space station branch in the astronaut office at the very beginning of the space station, before we even launched the very first element. And it was just amazing. I think the space station is one of the greatest accomplishments that humans have ever done. I don't think people realize just how complicated it was to build this gigantic structure. It's about the size, the habitable volume is about the size of a 5-bedroom house, and the truss is about the size of a football field, and it's just so big. And even look at that picture, you just cannot realize how big it is. But the really neat thing was that it's this partnership with all of our international partners. And it was truly amazing now, almost 20 years later, to just see how well we all work together. From that sort of a rough start at the beginning, learning how to deal with our Russian colleagues who thought they knew how to do space, and the U.S. did, and how we all now work together, so that even when the political situation at the level of our leaders is not going too well, at the working level, we're all friends and colleagues, and that's one of the things I love most about space. I think it's one of the things that brings us all together as one planet, one family with a common goal. Here's a picture of the station, and this is the current crew that's on board the station. We almost always have a crew of 6, and this is Jessica Meir and Christina Koch. They just very recently were the 2 women that did that all-female spacewalk, and we're really, really proud of them. I just think of how far we came from when I was in that Apollo suit to where they did the first all-female spacewalk, and then Stephanie Wilson, another one of the women astronauts, was the Capcom in mission control. So that was a pretty proud moment that just happened about 2 or 3 weeks ago. So the shuttle stopped flying in July of 2011, 135 flights. This is one of my favorite shots of the shuttle on the pad near the very end of the program. And after the shuttle stopped flying, we really had no way to send astronauts up to the International Space Station without relying on our Russian colleagues who launched the Russian Soyuz out of Baikonur. And so what NASA has been working on the last several years is sort of two things. One, we have a commercial crew program, which is being designed to take U.S. astronauts from Florida to the International Space Station. That's all they're being designed to do. And NASA selected two, the Boeing Starliner and the SpaceX Dragon. The SpaceX has been taking cargo to the International Space Station for several years. They just tested a short while ago the human-rated Dragon capsule, and they hopefully will be flying the first manned flight sometime next year. Boeing is going to have its first unmanned test hopefully before the end of the year. It's scheduled for December. Sierra Nevada was not selected to take humans up to the astronauts up to the space station, but it is going to be developed to take cargo up to the International Space Station, and I'm kind of hopeful that eventually it can be used to take humans as well. So that's what we're doing on the commercial crew side, and again, that's to take astronauts to the space station. What NASA is working on is the Orion vehicle, which is really just a large, like an Apollo capsule, but the Orion is being developed specifically to go beyond low Earth orbit, to take us back to the moon or wherever else that we want to go. The neat thing about Orion and the other two vehicles is they all have an abort system. So basically, if you have a problem with your rocket, you hit the abort button, it pulls you away, and the only thing is you might be over a different part of the Earth than you planned, but you'll land safely and be alive. So these are the three mock-ups of the three capsules. This is the SpaceX Dragon, the Boeing Starliner, and the Orion capsule. And these are the crews that have been named to fly the first two flights of each of those vehicles. So these are the two crews for the Boeing Starliner, and these are the crews for the first two flights of SpaceX. And hopefully we're going to be seeing those both next year. So stay tuned about that. President Trump has announced that he wants us to be back on the moon by 2024. That's pretty ambitious. I hope he's going to send us enough money so we can do that. But with enough money, NASA can work miracles. And we're all very, very excited. And the other thing was at the Apollo 11 anniversary in July, Vice President Pence came to the Kennedy Space Center and actually was interviewed by my daughter, who's a broadcast journalist, and he announced that the next person to step on the moon would be a female, at least the first one of the crew. So that's something exciting to look forward to. But I'm hopeful that we're going to build a base on the moon, much like the base in Antarctica, which I got to go visit that Antarctic Center, and it's just amazing the similarities. And so that's what I'm hopeful that we're going to be doing, and that it's going to be an international effort as well. But of course, that's just the stepping stone to where we really want to go, which is we really want to go to Mars. And but I really believe strongly that we need to go to the moon, where we're only 3 or 4 days away from home, and learn all those techniques of how to be self-sufficient, how to grow your own food, and so forth. And just to remind everybody just how far away Mars is. This is a picture of Earth taken from the Mars rover. And since the Mars rover has only been up there for a while, there's a very good chance that all of you are in that picture. But I just think visually, when you talk about how many million miles away Mars is, for me it just doesn't compute. But looking at that picture makes me realize just how far away Mars is, and crews are going to have to be well-trained and be self-sufficient. But I just think it's so exciting, and some of you young folks in the audience could be those first people that are going to step on Mars. So how exciting. I want to end with this slide. I've loved this slide since this was a NASA drawing that has been around almost since the time that I was selected as an astronaut. And my grandmother passed away in 2003 at the age of 105. She was born in 1898, and I marvel when I think about what she saw in her lifetime. You know, she was born basically in the horse and buggy days, to the development of the automobile, to development of flight, to seeing the first man step on the moon, to seeing her granddaughter launch on the Space Shuttle. And, you know, with the way technology is changing and the way things are developing so fast right now, I can't imagine that those of you in the audience that are lucky enough to live to be 100 or 105, you know, what that's going to be like, what you're going to see in your lifetime. I just think it's a really exciting time. Really want to encourage young folks, both male and female, but particularly get females interested, because I think this is such an exciting time, and I'm jealous. I wish I could start over and continue to do that. But thank you so much for your attention, and with that, I'll stop talking and maybe we have some time for some questions. We have microphones for questions, so if you want to raise your hand, we have a microphone on either side, so if you have a question. I don't think it's working.
Can you only work for NASA if you're a US citizen?
I'm sorry, say again?
Can you only work for NASA if you're a US citizen?
To be an astronaut, at the moment, you know, things can change. The rules can always be changed. But at the moment, the rules are you have to be a US citizen to be a US astronaut. But you certainly don't have to be a citizen to work for NASA. In fact, just before I retired, I was working on display development for the Orion spacecraft. And the two young men that were doing the primary coding and development work for those displays were from Belgium. And so to work for NASA, and I don't know if you're actually to be hired as a NASA civil servant, what the requirement is, but we have contractors, and they actually have their own company that contracted to NASA. So there's many ways to become involved with NASA besides actually working directly with NASA. And now with SpaceX and Virgin Galactic and Blue Origin, there's so many ways to get involved in space. And New Zealand is starting its own space agency. So I've been talking with folks since I've been here, you know, encouraging them to perhaps get involved with the space station program. The space station is funded right now through 2024, and there's a lot of talk about turning it over to the commercial sector so that people will be able to, and companies will be able to send their own people up to work on their experiments. So I think things are changing very rapidly, that's what I mean. And I think there's going to be lots of opportunities for people who want to go into space. And as I said, there's many exciting jobs if you love space, but you don't particularly want to go there, too. Mm-hmm. Yes, there's a... Do you have a microphone?
Sure, I've got that voice. It's on behalf of my mother. She's, we're First Nation people, we're Māori, native to Aotearoa, to here.
Mm-hmm.
My mother is most concerned about the junk.
About the what?
About the 250,000...
Oh, the space junk.
Space junk, yes. So how... Is there any work around actually, and also for all these young people here who are concerned about climate change, etc., how does that interrelate to Earth environment?
That's a very good question, and it's one that we worry about all the time. In fact, the greatest risk to the International Space Station is either a micrometeorite hit or space debris. Right at the moment, NORAD, as part of the U.S. Air Force, tracks all that space debris, at least the pieces that are big enough. And many times we had to move the shuttle or move the space station, either lower or raise the orbit a little bit to make sure that you don't, contact any space debris. So it's definitely a concern. The Association of Space Explorers, we actually have, it's one of our top concerns. We've talked, and we really think that what we need is an international space agency, and we also need something like the FAA for space. Because right now, any country that wants to launch anything into space, there's no regulatory mechanism. There's nobody that says, whoops, there's too many satellites at that orbit. You're going to have to pick a different orbit. And there's no mechanism to get rid of some of this space debris. I've heard talk of commercial companies trying to come up with vehicles or satellites that could go and sort of try to collect some of the bigger pieces. But it's definitely a concern. It's a concern of NASA. It's a concern of anybody who's going into space. I don't have any real answers right now, but we're certainly aware of it, thinking about it. Yes?
I've got a loud voice. Firstly, it's been amazing sitting here. It's just been fabulous listening to what you've got to say. I'm sitting here with some 10-year-olds and 12-year-olds. If any of them want to get involved in a space program, what advice do you have for them about an educational path?
Well, first, if you really love space, there's space camp. I would have given anything to have gone to space camp when I was your age. So there's that. Study hard in school, get good grades, take a lot of math and science classes. If you truly want to, if you want to be an astronaut, there's many jobs, as I tried to talk about, in the space program that are all fun. But if specifically you want to be an astronaut, then there's two pathways, which is to become a pilot, and that's kind of obvious. You join the military. You really, to get the experience you need to join the military, get the hours you need, and then at the moment, go to test pilot school, because that just gives them a very different level of experience. So that's one pathway. And then the other pathway is to be a mission specialist. And at the moment, again, you can really pick any area of science you want. One of my office mates is a veterinarian. And you say, well, what does that have to do with space? Well, he took a lot of science, and he's smart, and he's wound up going into space 4 times and doing many spacewalks. And so, and then, so you want to get good grades and have a degree, advanced degree in some area of science. And then, to be competitive, the last astronaut class that NASA selected picked 12 people. There were 18,000 applicants for those 2 positions. So you want your application to stick out. So you kind of want to show, like I was a scuba diver before I went to NASA, get your private pilot license. You want to just demonstrate, mountain climbing, any of those things that demonstrate that you are going to be comfortable in this weird environment and in risky situations. So those are the kind of things I would do. But things are changing quickly too, so who knows, I think pretty much in the future, perhaps, maybe you won't need to have a degree. Maybe people with degrees in the humanities and in other areas will also. I know my daughter would love to be the first broadcast journalist that goes into space. I want to go be a space tourist myself. I want to be able to just go up there and look out the window for as long as I can stay up there. Any more questions? Yes.
Elon Musk has plans of colonizing the Mars.
Mm-hmm.
Can you comment on that?
I wish him luck. I think it's going to be yes, we're all very supportive of what Elon did. When he first came along, over many years ago when I first heard about him, I thought he was nuts. He has since proven that he is not. And he's has a vision, and he goes after it, and he tackles things that many people would not even think of tackling. And I applaud him for wanting to go to Mars. And if he can figure out a way to do it faster and better than we can, we're all for that. I think as he found out in going into space, it's more difficult than you think it's going to be, and he's had his failures. And going to Mars is going to be an order of magnitude more difficult than anything he's attempted so far. But I hope he's successful. If he can do that and go straight to Mars, I still think, you know, we're all supportive. I still think going to the moon and learning the techniques that you're going to need and establishing an international base and doing research and figuring out how to protect yourself from radiation and all those different things, I still think that's the right way for NASA to plan. But if he can do that, I think everyone that I know was very supportive and found it exciting. I was skiing with a bunch of my friends when he had that launch where he had the Tesla car on orbit. I don't know if any of you saw that, but I mean, we were just thinking, wow, NASA would never do anything like that. And we thought it was so cool. So anything he does, as long as he's doing it safely. And I mean, I guess if people want to sign up for like one-way trips to Mars, I've heard of that too. I mean, you know, back in the days of people colonizing and going to other continents like Columbus, Magellan, Cook, and all of those, you know, oftentimes they were going and not coming back, you know. So that certainly, NASA will never sign up for that. They always want to have a plan for returning someone. But it's certainly, I think it's within people's rights if they want to sign up for that and understand what they're doing. Because eventually, if you do want to colonize another planet, you know, you're going to have to go do that and commit to, you know, perhaps being there till the end of your life. I know several of my friends that would sign up tomorrow. Are there any other questions? Yes? Oh, don't worry, I'll get to you. Yes?
What would you say has been the biggest factor in your successful career as an astronaut?
What would be the biggest factor in
Success.
you know, I think persistence is perhaps, and I think you find many astronauts saying it. For example, I don't know that it would have occurred to me if I hadn't been selected the first time to apply again. And then I found out that some of my friends applied 6 and 7 times before they got selected as an astronaut. So, you know, it may sound like when you hear someone's bio that everything went really smoothly. I didn't get into medical school the first time that I applied. I was on the waiting list the first time. You know, I've had failures along the way, but you don't give up. If you have a dream and you have something you really want to do, and like I always say, well, if you can't get in the front door, go around the back door. And, you know, I think if I happened to become an astronaut now with all the things that are happening with the commercial crew and so forth, I would have probably tried very hard to go work for one of them and contribute in some other way. So I really think that is important. And then just always like trying to do your best. But I think persistence is underrated. It is a factor for success.
This gentleman over here. Can we do this gentleman over here?
Okay, I promised this lady, and then I will promise I will. Okay, I'll get to you. Don't worry. Go ahead.
I appreciate it's not a constant, but what altitude are you in kilometers from the Earth? Are you orbiting?
What altitude are we in for the shuttle?
Yes, what
About 200 nautical miles, something like that. That's about where the space station is, and it's at about a 56-degree inclination. Some of the earlier shuttle flights, like my flight, was at a 28 degrees inclination, so you don't see as much of the Earth that way, but at 56 degrees you pretty much see everything. The only shuttle flights that were higher than that were the Space Telescope flights. They were at about 300 nautical miles. And if you go look at a picture of Earth from what I call like a normal shuttle attitude, which is 200 nautical miles, and then you look at pictures taken from one of the Space Telescope flights, you can really tell the difference in the curvature of the Earth. There's a real difference in the pictures from the two different altitudes. But the shuttle can't go much higher than that. It wasn't designed, it was only designed to be in low Earth orbit. I guess the question I've been asked more times than I know is, how was the moon? And I wouldn't know. The shuttle couldn't make it to the moon. I wish it could, but okay. Where is it? There you are.
So I'm firstly going to apologise to my girls for embarrassing them by talking to you.
I know that feeling.
Just a comment to those other little girls. My girls are going to Space Camp in Houston in December of next year, so it's very possible for Kiwi boys and girls to experience that. And I was very excited when STEM became STEAM. Can you talk to us a little bit about what the A has added?
The STEAM is for art. Luckily, I didn't need the A because my artistic ability is pretty limited. I wish it were not. I would give anything. I am envious of people that are artistic, and I marvel at some of the things that people create. But there are several astronauts that are very artistic. I don't know if you know Alan Bean. He was one of the Apollo astronauts who walked on the moon. He was actually what I call the den mother from our class, and so I feel very blessed to have had him as a mentor. And after he retired from NASA, he went to the Glassell School of Art, which is a really neat art school in Houston, and learned to paint, and then did all these amazing paintings of lunar landscapes. And he always incorporated something from the moon in all of his paintings. Dust, little pieces of the foil, and just various things that every painting he has. So he's had a very successful career as an artist, and in fact, years later, I was talking to him, and he said that he didn't think of himself as an astronaut that became an artist. He thinks of himself as an artist that happened to be an astronaut. And this is a person who was a fighter pilot, test pilot, walked on the moon, and that's how he described himself. Nicole Stott, one of my really good friends, is also an artist, very artistic. And normally, she gave me a bracelet she made, and I normally wear it, but I forgot to bring it on this trip. And she makes jewelry and paintings from all the images of pictures that she took and everything. So there are definitely people in the office that are artistic. I think a lot of us tend to be more left-brained than right-brained. But one of the best ways of helping people understand what it's like to be in space is through art. I mean, really through photography, through paintings. That's the best way to, more so than words. That's why when people ask me to talk about the space program and they say I can't use my slides, I go, okay, but it's not going to be the same because without the visual representation, it's really hard for people to understand how amazing it is. You know, like they say, a picture's worth 1,000 words. So there are, and then also music-wise, which is another part of art. A lot of the astronauts have carried instruments into orbit, and on the space station, they've had a flute, guitar, saxophone, just and a lot of astronauts love music and play instruments and brought them with them. So I think that's a really important part. And if you read about Nicole Stott, if you're really interested, she's a huge promoter of STEAM. Yes?
How much cooperation is there with China?
I'm sorry, how much
cooperation is there with China?
Zero. Unfortunately.
Including the space station themselves, is that correct?
Yeah, what I was kind of joking there, but from the United States point of view, we are precluded by law from cooperating with the Chinese. We had one of our Association of Space Explorers meetings a few years ago in Beijing, and the Chinese are definitely, going into space. They love space. They're building a space station. They've already had one. They're building another one. I have no doubt they're going to the moon. They're going to build a base on the moon. I tell young people that, when we were in the middle of the Cold War with the Soviet Union, if you had asked me that we were going to be partners with the Russians, I would have thought you were crazy. And so I think maybe we're kind of at that stage now with the Chinese, and that hopefully in the future things will change. It certainly doesn't preclude other countries from cooperating with China. I know the ESA definitely has some cooperative collaborative projects with the Chinese, and the Chinese were very vocal at our meeting saying that they wanted their station to be international. So that might actually be a way for some of the younger folks from New Zealand to go into space, because they definitely want an international aspect to their space station, if for no other reason than for political reasons. But I'm hopeful that just like we wound up being partners with the Russians, and then have learned to be friends since, that hopefully the same thing will happen with the Chinese. And one of the other things I tell young folks to do, or what I would recommend, is learning another language, such as Russian. And if I were guessing, I would guess that Chinese might be something that would be valuable in the future. I can't promise that will be true, but that's my guess. So, and if for no other reason, it's a really good exercise for your brain. Russian is the hardest thing I've ever tried to learn. And I've learned a lot of hard stuff. So, you had a question?
Can a person who has got a specific degree in any other science...
I'm sorry, could you just be a little louder?
Can a person who has got a specific degree in any other science apart from physics be an astronaut?
Can somebody, I couldn't quite hear it.
Do you have to just do physics to be an astronaut and do other sciences?
I'm sorry, I'm really can't hear it.
Which disciplines of science are useful for, is it just physics, or are other disciplines of science, any other disciplines in science useful?
Oh, you can really pick any area of science that you want to be an astronaut. And in fact, it's really important that you be doing something that you love, because the odds of getting selected as an astronaut, at least now, and like I keep saying, I cannot tell you what the future is going to be like, because things could change. But at the way things are now, you need to be doing something you really love. Some people come to interview to be an astronaut and find out they have a medical condition that they didn't know they had, like a heart murmur or kidney stones, or some of the things that preclude you, at least now, being an astronaut. Maybe in the future those won't even preclude you. So you really need to be doing something you love, independent of being an astronaut. And then, and so there's really, like I said, I'm trying to think the most different thing that anyone in the office does is, my office mate is a veterinarian, and he's an excellent astronaut. So we also have a few science teachers. We had a program originally when Krista McCullough flew on Challenger. After that, they stopped that teacher in space program. So they decided at some point that they were going to accept some teachers, but they had to be in the area of STEM, number one, and they had to get hired as a full-fledged astronaut, and they had to go through astronaut training. And we've had, I'm trying to think, maybe 4 or 5 of those, and they were amazing astronauts. All 4 or 5 that were science teachers or math teachers, and they became full professional astronauts, and they were all excellent.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. There's somebody way back there. Mm-hmm.
Hello, Anna. Thank you for the presentation. I really enjoyed it. So I'm a big space fan. I'm also from China. And I've got 2 questions for you. The first question is, do you have a space pen with you?
Do I have one?
Space pen with you.
The
Space pen?
specific space pen that works in zero gravity.
I'm sorry, it is
The
echoing.
pen you use in the space, like a space pen?
Space
Horizon.
pen. Yeah,
And do I have
pen.
a,
A space pen.
oh, the Fisher space pen?
Do you have it with you?
No.
My second question is, if a landing one, a real one, space pen,
Oh,
do I have the honor to ask you, do you have the honor, privilege to ask you to put your signature on my book, Space Book?
I'll be glad to do that.
Thank you.
Just wait till we finish up. Sorry, there's kind of like an echo in that. One more question, I'll let you pick them. Right, oh, there, okay. There you go. Go ahead. Real loud. Oh, okay, I'll do 2. Who was it you were going to pick? Okay, we'll do that too. Go ahead.
How did you deal with the excitement of being a new mom? And then with the excitement of being a new mom, and then had to go to this mission which involves a lot of risks. What are your thoughts? Because maybe something could happen and you...
Okay, I heard the second part. What was the first part? What was it like being a new mom and training and going into space?
Yeah, I had to go to this mission that involves a lot of risks.
It was very hard, you know, but I wanted to be an astronaut since I was 12, and I had this incredible honor, so there was no way that when they asked me to fly in space that I wasn't going to honor that commitment, and also for my own self, you know. But it was definitely hard. I would not have chosen to do it that way if I had been able to do it exactly as I wanted. But at the same time, it also probably helped me. I had the 2 things I loved most, and I learned to be very proficient at compartmentalizing. You know, when I was home, I was home. When I was at work, I was at work. I did a lot of things like one of my trainers on the arm remembers me carrying Karen, a little carrying thing, putting her on the floor while we were working in the simulator with some of our procedures for the robotic arm, and so, but leaving her then, knowing that there was a chance that you wouldn't come back, was probably the hardest thing I've ever done in my life. One thing that we did was we did a lot of videoing that year that I was training. Just to make sure that if anything happened to me, she could at least watch a lot of video. And then she became a broadcast journalist. So I always tell her that it was probably because we spent so much time, she was so used to being on camera. She just made it her career. But no, it's hard. But you know, it's not that much different than women who join and men who join the military, and they're away from their families for long periods of time. Police officers and law enforcement. I sat and tried to think about it once, like what's different about being an astronaut than these other people that also live in dangerous environments, and they go out any day going into combat or going to work as a police officer. And I think the difference is that there's one day that you're going out to launch, and you know what that day is. Whereas in these other jobs, it's just sort of a constant thing, and you don't know. That's the only thing I can think of, because there are a lot of people that have jobs where they're at risk and can get killed as well. And you know, and it's hard, but when you have a dream of something that you want, it's important to be true to yourself and to the things that you need. I didn't mention this, that I did after the birth of I was assigned to my second flight within a month after I landed. And when Challenger happened, I was about 6 weeks from flight. And so after Challenger happened, I knew we would not be flying for 2 to 3 years. And so we decided to have our second child. And then I discovered that 2 children are a lot more work than one. And I wound up taking a 7-year leave of absence. It wasn't planned. It just kind of happened a year at a time. I was very fortunate. My boss was a single father raising 5 children, so he was somebody who kind of understood the challenges, and so he allowed me to do that. Then in 1996, I came back. It was probably the hardest thing I've ever done in my life, coming back after being away for 7 years, because everything had changed. All the people that I came into the program with were pretty much gone or moved up into other positions. And all of a sudden, when I came back, they gave me this thing called a computer. And when I left, nobody had a computer. There was no such thing as email. I came back, and it was a total different way of doing business. It was totally different people. And so it took about a year or so to be comfortable. But then it turned out that I was in the right place at the right time to be chief of the space station branch, and so it all kind of worked out. But there's no easy answers to all of those things, and each person has to kind of figure out what works for them. And I always tell people, don't judge yourself according to somebody else. You have to do what's right for you. And I look back, and to this day, I never regret taking those 7 years, because those would never come back to me. But then I got to go on and continue and have another exciting career continue. So anyway, there was one other person that, where was the question? Pardon?
So I went to the Space Shuttle Program, and honestly was an amazing program. I recommend it so much to all the young audience. But my question is, how hard is it for females to get a really good job at NASA, like having to prove themselves as astronauts? How hard is that?
When I first came to NASA, there was only one female who was in a senior management position. There were women in mission control, but not too many. I mean, if you look at the mission control for Apollo 11, it's all men. If you look at the launch team, there was one woman at the launch control team for Apollo 11. But very slowly over the years, since we were selected, more and more women have come into the program. And one of the things that I really love about NASA is, and I can honestly say that I have never encountered any stigmatism about being a female. All that NASA cares about is if you're good at what you do. They don't care what you look like, what color you are, whether you're male, whether you're female. There was one point, I felt that mission specialists within the astronaut office had less opportunities because you were a mission specialist and not a pilot. Because basically, when we were first selected, the organization was very much a quasi-military organization. It's really changed over the 36 years that I was with NASA. But there was one point when the chief of the office was a female, and she was a mission specialist. The director of flight crew operations was female, and she was a mission specialist. And the center director was a female mission specialist, all at the same time. And nobody thought anything of it. It was just, they were the right people to do the job. I showed you, we just had our first 2 females together doing a spacewalk and everything. And that wasn't a stunt. They were up there, they were trained, and they did a really good job. And I can honestly say that at NASA, if you're good at what you do and you have the requirements, or whatever the requirements for the specific job, females are treated exactly the same as the males. They're flight directors, engineers, senior management. I don't think we've had a female administrator of NASA yet, but that's an appointed position. So that's a little different. That's not NASA's fault. So I really think NASA is one of the most amazing places to work. And in fact, I saw one of my female colleagues, Marcia Ivins, actually wrote something published somewhere on the internet, I can't remember where, defending NASA because a lot of times the perception sometimes is that females don't have the chance, and she feels exactly as I do, that if you're good at what you do, NASA doesn't care who you are, only that you're good and you do your best.
Okay, on that really positive note, I'd like to get you to thank Anna for a very